to season 3 of the Digital Rights Africa podcast, where we talk about everything data protection and privacy, cybersecurity, child online protection, intellectual property rights, and data governance issues across Africa. As usual, I am your host, and my name is Teki Akuetteh. And today we'll be joined on this episode by
Serge Ntamack.
Serge, where are you coming from?
I come from Cameroon, very proudly.
And what do you do? Can you let our audience know a bit more about you?
I am a privacy practitioner. I'm a privacy practitioner, public policy expert as well. And I used to work for multinational tech in the past. And now I'm a consultant.
I have known Serge for as long as I have been running around the corridors of this space, and so Serge, it's really warm to have you in this seat.
A pleasure.
I love to have people like you here, because you've worked, around the world. You've worked also significantly in Africa. You've worked in different capacities, working for some of the big guys in the space and all of that. And have had opportunities to see the digital rights landscape in other parts of the globe vis-a-vis Ghana. So let me just narrow this, vis-a-vis Africa. Let me just narrow this down a bit. What do you think we are? Are we ready? Are we getting it right? Are we missing a point in Africa?
I think they are. Thanks for that, Teki, and thanks for hosting me. I think there are different perspectives to it. I would say it depends on where you're coming from. If you're looking at it from you're looking at technology advances, you might be tempted to say we're late, we are not there, we're missing, etc. And I'll come back to that. But if you're looking at it from the historical approach, you look at it and say, hey, look, Africa actually look at how we've been able, for instance, to master the mobile space, or even the mobile money, the payments, etc. Space. You say, well, I think we're actually doing very well.
Yeah.
But I think the answer to that is actually probably somewhere in the middle. Mm-hmm. And I would say that, in terms of the technological advances in the world, when you look at where Europe and the US were 30 years ago, I believe that Africa is actually on the right path. We're, of course, far from being there, but I think we're on the right path in terms of understanding, I believe. Well, I'll start before understanding is adopting. Mm-hmm. Adopting, the usage, etc., etc. Understanding a little less, I would say, but I think we're getting there, because this type of conversations that we're having now, for instance, frankly, was not really imaginable 4, 5, 6 years ago, right?
Definitely.
It was not really mainstream. Today,
yes, it is.
It is. So I would say we're getting there, frankly. We made some great progress, and depending on how from where you're
and I really love the angle that you're looking at this, because I always say that, if we're looking at our continent, we can't adopt technology, line hook and sinker to what everybody else is doing. It has to work for us. I mean, that's the purpose for technology. And if we look at the mobile space, if we look at broadband technologies, it means something different than landlines and fixed lines, whereby even if you look at the technological space, there are some spaces where Africa is far more advanced than the rest of the world, just because we actually adopted these technologies to suit our needs. But having said that, what do you think it's really going to take, for us to really appreciate that these technologies are there to help us? And so it's not just about adopting them, although to a large extent in today's world, I think that we cannot do without it. But it's about looking at what best fits us, and then we go with that.
Very good question, actually. I think again, I'll be sort of nuanced on that. I think when you look, and I'll start from the perspective of mature markets, and what I call mature markets, of course, is the EU, the US. When you look at the EU today, for instance, and we see all the push around the GDPR and even the EU AI Act, I think it's because now they're looking at it really probably a lot from the human rights side.
Yes.
And it's also because they've been, it's a mature society economically, industrially, so they're probably more concerned about some of the,
You mean they've eaten and they are full, so they can think about other
I'm
things.
not saying that, but you see what I mean, right? And so it's quite different from our perspective, and I think for us is what it's going to take. I think we can learn from history, and I'm a big believer in history and the lessons from history. I think what's happening is when you look at what made some of these countries successful, and including countries like, let's say, China, who's been successful in the last 30 years, you look at a few critical things like education.
Yes.
I think we're not doing a good job at educating our people.
Yes.
When you talk about data protection, frankly, you haven't actually addressed what I would call the foundation for people, for them to first understand digitization. That civility, I would call it exactly. So when you talk about data protection, it's just like, it's far.
What is this?
Right.
Yeah.
So education for me is super critical. The second thing that I think is important is the mindset of how can we turn these technological advances into business opportunities. I'm happy, for instance, to see how Africans are very active on social media and turning into your small shows. People who are selling a lot of stuff, etc. It's good, but we need to have a way of amplifying it or institutionalizing, and that's where you have the government.
Yeah.
So that's the third pillar. We need to have vision around it. Some of the countries in Africa, you talk about Mauritius, Rwanda, for instance, Kenya to some extent, have understood it. So you need that political, will to be able to drive it. And then I think the fourth pillar that I'll say is basically the fact that you need to have cooperation. Because we cannot do it. Look, most of our countries are small countries. Yeah. You take out South Africa, Nigeria, the usual big ones.
Guys.
So think about Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Cameroon. We need to work together to make sure that we actually increase the size of the pie instead of fighting for the same small opportunities. So for me, those are the four things I believe. That probably more than that, several others, but I think these are the four things that will help us to really sort of take opportunity or take advantage of this.
Yes, it's interesting. I believe this season you're about the fourth or fifth person that is raising this issue of education, right? And yet, I believe most of our countries are jumping on AI strategy. We've come a long way from our ICT policies to ICT strategies to through to broadband policies, broadband strategies. And I'm sure very soon, yes, we've already started hearing countries talk about AI strategy and all of that. Interestingly, when you look at a lot of these policies, right, there's always that element around, because so that tends to mean that we see the challenge around education. So there's always an element around education in a lot of these policies and strategies. So where are we missing it?
Yes, I think it's a fascinating thing to observe. When you see that gap between, of course, the declarations and even the policy making, because the actual policies around it, you talk about the strategies, etc., and the implementation, execution. But I think it comes back to something that we discussed during the summit is follow the money. And I'll be blunt, it's money. You put your money where your mouth is. A lot of the African countries, governments, they're very forceful about they want to educate people, they believe that it's important, etc. But education costs a lot of money.
That's true.
And when it comes to basic accounting, are they willing to, because you need to take that money from somewhere and put it somewhere and put it in education? Are they willing to do that? That's where I believe education ministers lose the fight most of the time. I believe that, look, they believe in this, and they, obviously in most governments, they are the ones that are actually, pushing for this. But when you sit down with your finance minister or the treasury, and there has to be trade-off about where we put the money, I'm not sure they are really.
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes I really don't blame the governments, right? Because if you have to choose between healthcare and people getting clean water to drink.
Absolutely.
And of course, sometimes we have our issues with corruption, and this is not to, say that we don't have challenges and misuse. But if you have to make those choices, I really don't blame them. But and so do you see, is there any other way around it? Because we really cannot drive these grand agendas without creating the right ecosystem for it. So what do you see as some of the ways around that?
Look, there is no easy way. One of the things that I'm very passionate about is how can we, let me just put it this way. You have a scenario where people are leaving the African continent in droves. They're immigrating, right? And we know they are talented people.
Yes.
Maybe one thing that we can do that is really very simple is how can we tap into that diaspora, knowledge and resources. And I agree with you that, look, sometimes it's difficult for governments to just trade on between various emergencies, I would say, priorities.
Yeah.
But for me, one of the avenues to be able to sort of do something about it is think about the diaspora and see how we can actually leverage the diaspora. And having engaged a lot of them, I know they're willing to support.
Yeah.
Because the good thing about Africa and the African diaspora is that they're always looking back home.
But I think that I have heard this conversation before, right? And sometimes working with government itself has its challenges. So should this be driven by governments, or should we look at private sector? Should we look at civil society? Should we look at it from the institutional level, right? At the lowest level, rather than at the top where the bureaucracy is going to kick in and the requirements and policies and MOUs that needs to be, because by the time we're done, they're tired of us and they don't want to work anymore.
I think, look, it's a good point about the civil society. I think every stakeholder has its role. The role of the government is super important. Let's just acknowledge it.
I do.
It's important to have the government on board, but it doesn't mean that we can't do anything. And just speaking about some experience that I had when I work in big tech, we actually set up a project where I think it was called My Skills for Africa. And basically the idea was there were a lot of projects, around IT in some African countries, which use that company's technology. And that requires some certain skills, specialized skills. And instead of paying expensive experts, to fly from, and say, why don't we get the diaspora that was working in that tech company, that was based in the US, Canada, etc., and then get them to come and work on these projects, right? And it worked wonder, because they brought that expertise that was lacking, that was missing, locally. They brought that enthusiasm because it was a way for them to connect,
exactly,
right? And it brought that scalability, to be able to really work on big projects. And I, personally, for instance, I designed a project, and I worked on a project in Cameroon where a hospital, had a chain of hospitals with more than 20 hospitals across Cameroon, more than 4,000 employees. They needed to digitize their processes. We're able to get people from India, from the US, etc., to come and help us to do it. So me, that was a good example on how the private sector of society can think about network. The power of the network, just reaching out and just building some sort of connections that can help to drive this forward, and then see how the government can actually just join or maybe just help to amplify it.
And let me talk about, I mean, this is very interesting. I'd like to dig deep, but we don't have a lot of time.
Yeah.
The elephant in the room, Africa free, Continental free trade agreement and the current ongoing discussions around a possible protocol on digital trade and e-commerce. And I mean, I have earlier been part of some level of discussions around what this protocol is going to look like. As of now, nobody really knows what is going to go in, what's going to come out, and all of that. Of particular importance for us as Africa Digital Rights Hub is the fact that, you know, these are going to really bring on board particular digital rights issues. What's your take on that?
Look, I think on one hand, to me, AFCFTA, it's a huge opportunity for us to make a difference. It provides that platform, that compelling, I hope, platform that will help to put everything together and actually sort of channel all the efforts that we're making. But at the same time, I'm also a bit disappointed by the fact that there could be more transparency in the way the negotiations are being conducted. I do understand that negotiators are representatives from governments,
Yes.
right? And that civil society is not negotiating over the private sector. But I think, of course, I believe in a multi-stakeholder dialogue. You do have people who know about these issues from a private sector or civil society perspective. I think it's fair that, and it's even valuable that they actually be to some extent, you know, associated. I think they probably did make some efforts to, you know, bring people on board. But, you know, of course, we're going to have it a bit more consistently and a bit more transparency in terms of where we're going. Because I think the negotiations and the protocol at the end has the power to really change the game, you know. And I think at that level of expectation, it is, of course, important.
I think for me, my biggest concern, particularly around the digital trade and e-commerce protocol, has been, of course, I mentioned the digital rights issues. And the concern centers again around capacity on these issues, right? Capacity across Africa on these issues are limited.
Sure.
So who are the people in the countries negotiating? If they are the usual suspects, which would be the trade ministries and all of that, what kind of capabilities do they have to appreciate and to start looking at the digital rights aspects and components? And if they don't have those capabilities, then what is happening there?
Yeah, I think I'll say I'll bring a sort of a nuance there. I think it depends on the countries. Look, probably the most likely scenarios in most countries, and I'll take the example of Cameroon, where I'm coming from, is that you have the negotiating machinery, the trade negotiators, the usual suspects that we know, who are doing their things. You know, they have their parameters, etc., and they just forging ahead.
What parameters are
and the
they
parameters
following?
is, look, the reality, and I've been trade negotiator before, is that most of the negotiations are centered around trading goods. Let's just
Exactly.
face it.
But we've signed the protocol.
We've signed the
on
protocol,
goods and
but they are the
services.
same people.
That is the problem.
They're the same people, right? And so you expect that, you know, in issues around on digital trade, you know, you probably have a bit more, I would say, non-government, you know, expertise.
Well, I wouldn't even say non-government.
Yeah.
It's governments have to negotiate, then governments should. But then the expertise to, you know, to bring about that informed process must be there. So whether government is hiring or paying for the expertise, we need to start thinking about that, don't you think so?
I think so. And I believe that there is certainly a way for that expertise to be involved. But I will also posit that, look, I think that expertise should maybe just be more forceful. I think
forceful in terms of what?
And I'll tell you what I think.
Yeah.
I believe that by just some of the things that can happen, I'm sure people have done it already, is come together, put together, propositions and say, this is what we believe, this is how this should look like, and I will just giving it to you.
So we should push it to the countries.
We should push it to the countries, we should push it to the secretariat, we should push it to the media, just let it known. Because people will ask you, okay, so what are you proposing?
Yes.
So you're sitting there complaining that you're not being, involved, but, show that you're relevant.
Yeah.
You can argue whether that's fair or not, but the reality is that if you have something to show,
you should.
People will listen. Yeah. Will be forced to listen to you. So I believe that the civil society, the private sector, etc., has a role to play proactively in terms of putting together ideas and pushing it in front of negotiators so they listen.
Okay. I think I really like that, but unfortunately, Serge, we've come to our end of our time, but I'll just give you maybe a few minutes to talk about anything pressing on your heart.
Well, thank you very much, Teki. I think, to me, I'll say I'm super excited about the fact that we are talking about data protection in Africa. The way we're talking about it today, that is like sort of mainstream. Where you have more than 20 countries that have data protection regulations and counting. My home country is working on a draft on a bill. To me, when I look back, it is extraordinary. And I'll say now one means more, it's really extraordinary. So it means that the work that's been done is tremendous. And the future is bright. Emerging technology challenges are going to be there. You have generative AI. Frankly, who knows? In 3 years' time, there will be something else.
Yeah.
But we have to get excited about the fact that we know where to focus in terms of our capacity as Africans to be able to not only consume, but sort of be able to engage, not only engage, even I would say influence those technologies, and that's how we should think. So there is a mindset shift that you should help to just drive and just make sure that it's.
So you have to come back soon to this table, and on that note, we've come to at the end of another episode of season 3 of the Digital Rights Africa podcast. And, we couldn't have ended on a better note that we really need to all start coming around the table. We need to push. We need to really look beyond these technologies and also think about how best we can apply them to suit our peculiar circumstances as Africans. Thank you once again for joining us. And my name is Teki Akuetteh. If you haven't subscribed yet to our podcast, kindly do so. Until I see you again next time, do well to join us. Bye.